Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Madeline Berg. I'm the Director of Content for Seed World Group, and I'm delighted to be your host today. For most of our long history, humans have bred plants to meet our changing needs. Now the stakes are even higher. With the climate changing fast and more mouths to feed than ever, plant breeding is arguably more important than it has ever been before. We're looking to plant breeding to help our crops withstand immediate weather challenges like drought and heat, tackle rapidly spreading or changing pests or disease, and produce more when resources, whether that's land, water, or inputs, are limited. Today on Seed Speaks, we're going to tackle a very big topic: how plant breeders breed for more climate resilient agriculture. I'm very pleased and very grateful to have with me today two very distinguished speakers. I have Dr. Matthew Reynolds and Dr. Patrick Byre. Thank you to both of you for making time to join us today.
My pleasure.
Likewise.
Dr. Reynolds is Distinguished Scientist and Head of Wheat Physiology at CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. He's working near Mexico City. He wrote a research study entitled Harnessing Translational Research in Wheat for Climate Resilience. One of Dr. Reynolds' key roles has been developing global consortia to tackle the challenge of climate change. Dr. Byre is Professor Emeritus of Plant Breeding and Genetics at Colorado State University. He's written several studies relating to our topic today, including Plant Breeding for Climate Change, Opportunities for Adaptation and Mitigation, and Climate Change Impacts Agricultural Productivity and Food Security. His most recent work has been as a science communicator working with the USDA, especially relating to plant genetic resources. Dr. Reynolds, let me start with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work at CIMMYT, specifically that relating to climate change?
Yeah, what we do in physiology is to try to understand what are the many traits involved in adapting to warmer conditions or drought, or there's a lot of stressors, which I'd be happy to talk about. And we look for traits within the more elite breeding material, but often you don't get the variation you need. So we go to collections, global collections of wheat. At CIMMYT, we have a couple of 100,000 accessions. And of course, that's a big task, but one can use tools, molecular tools, for example, to narrow that down. And then we test those in the field, narrow them down to panels, and eventually pick the really special genotypes. It might be a landrace. It might be something derived from a wild wheat relative that has a particular tolerance for the trait we're looking for. And then we combine these traits in a pre-breeding context and distribute the higher performing lines around the world, and with the hope of broadening the gene pool for breeders, public and private, wherever they are.
Excellent. Perfect. Thanks for that. Dr. Byre, can I throw the same question to you? Tell us about your work at Colorado State, specifically how it relates to a changing climate.
Right. I've been interested in a long time, excuse me, with the potential of, I need to take a drink. I've been interested a long time in the potential of plant genetic resources for crop improvement. And by genetic resources, I mean all of the materials conserved in gene banks around the world. Matthew's institution is one of the largest, and USDA also has a very large collection. It's sometimes referred to as a gold mine of potentially valuable genes, and sometimes as a morgue where things go but never leave because they're not well utilized. So I've been interested in evaluating both land races of maize when I worked at Matthew's institution in Mexico, and in Colorado looking at some of the wild relatives of wheat. We know that these wild relatives have a lot of resilience. The challenge is to get those beneficial traits into an adapted, competitive, elite background. Breeders are sometimes reluctant to look at these wild materials because they feel like the performance of their lines will suffer as a result. So we really need to find tools that we can extract the beneficial parts and leave the garbage behind. So part of this work I've done has been looking at wheat roots, looking at especially the roots of wild relatives, Aegilops tauschii in particular. We've looked at things like performance in the field under managed drought situations. We've looked at multiple locations around Colorado and looking for performance. So have done a number of things trying to improve drought tolerance in particular. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, well, let me expand a little bit on where you started, speaking of drought tolerance there. Can you give us sort of the 10,000-foot view of what we're up against? So drought tolerance is certainly one stressor that is going to be an increasing challenge due to a changing climate. What other biotic and abiotic stressors are the keys that plant breeding has to tackle?
Yeah, well, one of the really big ones is heat. And many of our crops are already performing at their temperature maximum. So just a little bit of an increase, especially in places like Africa that are already suffering from heat, they are very vulnerable. And it depends on the crop. Wheat, for example, is more of a cool season adapted crop. Maize and sorghum can withstand higher temperatures, but heat itself is very much a concern, but also the combination of stresses. If you have heat and drought together, the response of a genotype might be different than looking at each of those stresses separately. And then, of course, just to complicate things, the effect of these stresses depends on when in the life cycle of a crop they occur. The heat and drought at the seedling stage or at flowering could be quite different than the effect in the later stages of crop maturation. So that's one of the things that people like Matthew and I need to keep in mind.
For sure, absolutely. What about carbon dioxide levels?
Yes, well, for a long time it was thought that increasing carbon dioxide could actually have a fertilization effect, that it could benefit certain crops like wheat. I think recently some modeling work and some experimental work has shown that benefit may not be as great as had hoped for. Maybe Matthew could expand on that a little bit. But you also mentioned biotic stresses. And yes, there's a whole range of different organisms, both pest and pathogens, that are predicted to become more serious with a warming climate. We have some examples of this already, of different diseases expanding into new niches. And these organisms, thinking fungi in particular, have a tremendous ability to adapt and evolve. You know, there are billions of opportunities in the number of spores that are produced in a field in a given year for evolution to occur. So it's often described as an arms race. The evolution of the pathogen versus the breeding progress that can be made to incorporate resistance.
Absolutely. Dr. Reynolds, do you want to add to that list?
Well, the biotic stresses, very serious. It's always been a problem for wheat. Rusts, fusarium. There are many diseases that are prevalent all around the world. So CIMMYT tries to tackle the major diseases and embed disease resistance within the crops so that our smallholder farmers don't need to use fungicide and so on. We estimate there's probably 1 or 2 billion liters of fungicide have been saved just because of that breeding effort. And that has been going on since the 70s. But now we're starting to see, as Pat says, a higher rate of pathotype evolution, and that's what you expect when you have changing or variable climates. And we've even seen diseases jump species barriers, like rice blast jump to wheat. And that is a very, very serious concern. The other thing that's of concern is that insects, they love warmer climates. So I don't think it's hit us yet, but when it does, we're going to be busy trying to breed for those kinds of resistances. And then even as Pat mentioned, heat, you've got chronic heat, early heat, late heat, and then you have this thing, heat waves, where suddenly the temperatures are 3-4 degrees higher for a few days. And if that comes at a critical growth stage like anthesis flowering, that can create a lot of damage to the plant. And so, I mean, these are just some of them. There are, the unpredictability of rainfall is something that is increasingly obvious, and it makes it very difficult for farmers to know when to plant, and they may suffer complete loss. They may end up with waterlogging at the other end of the cycle because all the rain comes late, and then you have, the roots of plants are like our lungs, and if you waterlog them, the plants can't breathe. They don't live very long. So you have a lot of related problems like that, and that leads on to other problems. For example, soil erosion. If you have very heavy rains, which are predicted, less predictable, more sporadic, they wash soil away. And so there are many, many aspects. Frosts, colder winters. We saw that last year, I think. Vancouver had its hottest summer and its coldest winter in the same year. I mean, when you start, and we've always said the rhetoric has been, well, the northern parts of the world will be better off under climate change. Does not seem to be the case so far. And then there's other issues, permafrost melting, greenhouse gases being released. I mean, it's a whole can of worms.
A very, very daunting challenge. So now what Dr. Burns said was that it is an arms race. Let me throw it to both of you. Do you feel this is a arms race that plant breeders can keep up with? Do you have confidence that breeding can do what is necessary to keep agriculture strong and viable?
Well, I will just throw in that if we were breeding and selecting for a consistent stress, for example, increasing temperature, going up at a gradual level, or increasing drought and moisture stresses, I think plant breeding could relate to that. The hard part is that, as Matthew referred to, it bounces up and down. We're going to have wet years and dry years. We're going to have cold snaps in an overall warm year. So that variability is very hard to breed for. So that is going to be a challenge. I think it's going to take a lot of assistance by allied sciences, computer modelers, physiologists, molecular biologists, not just the breeders working by themselves as they may have done in the past, but more of a team effort to predict, these are the scenarios we're going to face in the future. And these are the types of gene combinations that we will need. So it's going to take maybe more coordination than we've had in the past, and maybe more funding to really keep up with problems.
Excellent. Dr. Reynolds, do you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that Pat said. And it's going to be, there has been progress. For example, at CIMMYT for wheat, we've been breeding for high temperature regions for a long time, like in the Sudan, for example, Bangladesh. And so we already have some heat tolerance. We've been breeding for drought, so we have some drought adaptation. So you can fine tune or allocate resources, because most of the regions have been until now temperate irrigated regions. And so we're going to have to bring germplasm from different streams to there. And I think, from what I've seen in genetic resource collections, I think there's reason to be hopeful. But there seems to be too much complacency among, it's hard to say, probably politicians. It's a bit like the don't look up idea, right? And here it is, don't look down at the ground and see how badly your crops are doing. We're pushing hard to raise attention to this issue, but it seems to be, it is quite challenging to raise the kind of resources you need. I'll give you an example. In our lab, we recently, with collaborators, demonstrated a proof of concept that one can actually get meaningful data throughout this growing season from satellites. So one could vastly expand the network of testing and collect a lot more data. And as Pat says, use that data in modeling. The modeling communities are coming together now, especially with artificial intelligence as a tool, deep learning. If we have the data that satellites potentially could give us, then I think we are in an even better position. But whether or not the funding comes through is always, this is something that is an unknown.
Okay, let's expand on that. So, Dr. Byrne, you mentioned that there needs to be sort of a changing strategy of bringing in multiple expertises to tackle something like this. Dr. Reynolds, you mentioned big data being a key piece of technology. How much is changing technology, changing attitudes about machine learning and how people should maybe collaborate on something like this? How much is that going to be able to change outcomes compared to, say, a decade ago when these kind of technologies or these strategies and attitudes might have been different?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that I think a lot of what we're talking about is really public sector research. It really depends on an organization that has a view of societal benefit and is willing to invest for the long term, as opposed to private sector, which is where a lot of our breeding takes place. I think private sector has been doing a great job of producing elite cultivars, but with a short time frame. They need to get the best hybrids on the market the next year, right, to satisfy shareholders. They are not often interested in genetic resources that are in gene banks. It's just viewed as too long-term of an investment that's not going to pay off. And so funding through national governments, state public universities, foundations, organizations like Summit are going to be really crucial. And I hope that these organizations will be able to access the type of technology that you mentioned, Madeline, the machine learning, the high throughput data analysis type of things. But I think in general, those opportunities are available as long as there's the funding to enter into contracts with them.
Makes so much sense. Dr. Reynolds, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, and there's another issue about being able to tackle these issues, and that is that science tends to grow a little asymmetrically. And a couple of years ago, I surveyed the major seed companies, the really big ones, and we came up with a list of 4 areas that were urgent, that had massive knowledge gaps in the literature. And we had modelers involved in that project and academics who were experts in that areas. And until those gaps are filled, our breeding models are always going to be, they're not going to be precise enough. Our crop simulation models are not going to be precise enough. Areas like respiration, which goes on 24 hours a day, but we know a lot more about photosynthesis that goes on just 12 hours a day, depending on where you are. Roots, we've ignored them because they are difficult to work with. Anything that happens at night, the whole physiology at night, we kind of assume the plant goes to sleep. But of course, just as we do sleep, things are happening physiologically in us and also in the plants. But we know very, very little about what happens at night. So there are tremendous research opportunities that would fill major gaps in our models and that then could be tested, for example, using in silico. If you have AI and you have a model and you can run different simulations to see what combinations of traits are most likely to give you a climate resilience or high yield, or what interaction of alleles is required, then you can have real practical crossing and selection models that breeders can use. And there is an enormous amount of enthusiasm to develop those models. And the disciplines are coming together, different kinds of modeling, as I said. But it will take, again, like a consortium, and consortiums need, apart from a lot of goodwill, which there is in our community, it will need funding organizations to backstop that kind of work. And not just short term. These are longer term problems.
Matthew,
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, in your survey of companies, did you get the sense that the private sector was in fact interested in these long-term questions? And
they are definitely they are definitely interested, because we reached consensus on around 5 traits in particular, and how filling the knowledge gap would help the modeling and the screening of genetic resources. They are interested. But of course, companies have become dependent a lot on public sector investment in more basic research. And so that's part of the plan, is to say, look, guys, let's get together, because the public sector coffers are diminishing. And, let's do this in pre-competitive space, so that we raise the bar for everyone. And then all the companies can make profit, and all of the people, we help the food security situation, obviously. So there's enthusiasm, but, there are always steps that have to be gone through. And the organization Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research in DC they are interested in convening such a meeting because they are, that is one of their main thrusts is to encourage the public and private sectors to work together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, they are interested. It's just that they tend to invest closer to product,
Mm-hmm.
but they know also that there are knowledge gaps and that they would, it makes sense to work together to fill them.
Yeah.
But it's a very big shift of thinking from within the private sector to consider working together.
FFAR have done quite well, but yeah, generally they're in competition, which is why you have to define what is pre-competitive space. And so if you say, look, there's nothing, and there's not enough in the literature to be able to select for a respiration that is more efficient, they're all like shaking their heads. None of them have an advantage really. So they're like, yeah, let's do this pre-competitively and we put in the resources we can.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I am watching the time ticking down so quickly. I feel like we could chat for many hours about this subject. I just wanted to make sure I get a couple of other questions in. Dr. Byrne, now one of the areas that you have been really looking at is the mitigation end. Can you speak a little bit to the breeding efforts you're doing in that area?
Yeah, oftentimes we talk about adaptation to climate change, more drought and heat resistance. But another aspect of that is, can plant breeding actually help address the causes of climate change and reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? And one of the ways of doing that is to select for deep-rooted plants, and especially plants that have particular composition. A couple of the compounds that have been noted are suberin and lignin, which trap a lot of carbon and sequester them deep in the soil profile. So to the extent that breeders can select for those traits, there's really the opportunity that farmers could help reduce CO2. Now, as Matthew mentioned, roots are just a terrible, difficult, challenging set of traits to look at. But there are technologies and ways to do that. I think one of the issues with this type of mitigation work is that how do you compensate farmers, for example, for if they decide to grow a carbon sequestering plant that may not yield as well as a conventional crop? We don't really have the data, in my understanding, to put a price tag on that. So that would be something that would have to happen. Now, another intriguing part of the mitigation is biological nitrification inhibition. And Matthew, I know at CIMMYT, there's been work going on in this BNI trait. And so that's a way that nitrous oxide emissions could be reduced. And that's a potent greenhouse gas as a result of nitrogen fertilizers. And Matthew, I don't know if you would feel comfortable describing the work at CIMMYT on BNI in wheat. I know our breeder here in Colorado is very interested in getting access to the gene that's been identified.
Well, there is we have a big new project, the were lines transformed with chromatin from Maize that attracts these bacteria in the soil. And so we're looking to scale that out, provide more proofs of concept. What are the compounds that attract But now we're also and since Madeline, you asked about what else. Pat talks about mitigation, which makes a lot of sense, and there are other ways of looking at this, not just from a purely genetic point of view or even necessarily scientific, because with improved agronomic systems, one can also protect the crop from certain stresses. For example, residue retention can keep the soil cooler or warmer, depending on what you're facing, for example. And you are able to reduce certain inputs with certain agronomies, which also aids with the mitigation strategy. So, and you mentioned BNI, and it's like there are proofs of concept in evolution of these kinds of interactions. One is rhizobial fixation of nitrogen in legumes. Another one is fungi interact with plant roots and bring mobilized phosphorus when that is short. And we're thinking, well, what else can these bacteria do? Here's another enormous area of ignorance, is what's going on in the soil ecology. One thing is the roots, but they interact within an enormous ecology of microbes in the soil, and they exude preferential substances to attract certain microbes that may, for example, BNI is an example, but there are others that protect them from soil-borne diseases. I've seen publications on protection from drought even. And this is a very unexplored area. So if you combine that with, for example, the idea of reforestation, this is an issue that is important not just for the environment, for the human environment, but a forest will couple with the atmosphere and attract rain. When you have bare fields of soil, it's kind of the opposite effect, which is why you can easily end up with desertification if the soils erode. So there are many ways to try to mitigate and to alternative ways to attack this problem. But of course, the genetics, the seeds, is the one that especially smallholder farmers are most attracted to. Seed embedded technology, we call it. And so maybe we do need a bit of a paradigm shift to probably subsidize farmers to be able to be more innovative than they currently have resources for.
I just wish we had double or triple the amount of time to chat. I feel like we've dug into such fascinating conversation, and we've obviously barely scratched the surface. The key takeaway being we need more dollars, more investment, more discussion like this to
more
keep this.
and more getting together.
Mm-hmm. Collaboration.
Academia is a competitive environment. Institutions like CIMMYT, for example, well, I can't say it's not competitive, but people are focused on a particular problem and mission. And increasingly, academics working in plant sciences are seeing the value of linking with plant breeders so that their work, sometimes their life's work, can be translated into real societal impacts. So those consortia not only bring groups together and identify, the translation, because there is a translational step from a technology that may be published in a great journal, but then there's no follow-on, and we need more of that, so that there's just more tools in the toolbox.
Absolutely,
for scientists and breeders. Yeah.
I hate to have to cut off this conversation. Unfortunately, it's all the time we've got for today, but I am so grateful to you both, Dr. Byrne, Dr. Reynolds, for making time. I enormously appreciated our chat. For those watching, thank you for tuning in. And if you missed any part of today's live stream, don't worry. We will have it available on demand on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. If you have questions about this subject, which I'm sure there will be many, or ideas for future topics that we could tackle on Seed Speaks, I'd love to hear it. Send a message to Seed World's Facebook page, or feel free to reach out directly to me anytime. Next week, join us again when our editor, Ashley Robinson, is going to be tackling another big topic, the impact of social media on our perceptions of weather. Thank you for watching today, and have a great rest of your day. And one last giant thank you to you, Dr. Byrne, and to you, Dr. Reynolds, for joining us.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Madeline, for inviting us. And it was nice that we knew each other.